You guys are all very nice. Thank you all for being here. My name is Erwin Kehrt, and I know that today is a very special day. I know that Avengers comes out tonight, so if you are missing it, to be here, there might be one person. Thank you. So let's get started. I'm going to go over some very high-level things about React, and we'll start with a quick introduction, right? This is just to get ourselves to know a little bit about the history of React. So React was created at Facebook in 2011 by this guy named Jordan Walk, I believe is how you pronounce it. I assume he worked with other people, but he was like the main guy that gets the credit at least. And from everything that I read back in 2011, it was not received with like open arms necessarily at first, right? There was a lot of negativity around it. But little by little, Facebook was able to show the world that the power of this thing. I think that they integrated it into their newsfeed application first, and so then by 2013 they open source it, and different companies start taking advantage of this thing, right? You have Instagram and a couple others, and by 2015, so 4 years later, right? There's if you have followed Netflix, right? There's like they have a blog where they put news about what they're doing in their technology. And they posted a blog post saying that they had switched to React full-time, right? This was their big thing now. And next thing you know, you have other companies, like big names that we know, like Airbnb. Nowadays you have like Dropbox, Uber, Pinterest, Lyft, Twitter, and some of the big names that I found, but that list is ginormous. And there's a ton of companies that you probably have not heard of as well. So it's become a very big deal. By 2016, we had React Native, which allows React to work on like mobile devices. Redux and MobX, which I believe both of those kind of help you manage state in a bigger application. And then Facebook develops GraphQL, which isn't necessarily part of React, but they continue developing tools to help you be able to bring your applications into React. And like I said, this is going to be very high level. The goal of tonight, I think, is for everybody here to walk away comfortable with at least create React app on your machines, and for you to at least know what's going on in that Hello World application, right? How many people here, if we could do like a show of hands, have done any React development? Okay, so the majority. All right, that's good. So hopefully, if you have done this before, this isn't, you still remember this stuff because it's very basic. And if you haven't done this, hopefully it gets you to the point where you feel comfortable. And a lot of the stuff that we'll cover is, since it is very high level, I will say it's generally true. About half of what I'm going to tell you is true, and half of it is false. So it's up to you to research when you go home. I'm just kidding. That's a joke. No, it's generally true. Right? There are some details that we can get into, but I don't think we need to know a lot of that stuff to just get started. So keep in mind, that this is you guys. I think you guys will see. So one of the things that I read recently was this Stack Overflow. They do a survey every year, right? And maybe some of you guys have taken this. And they have really interesting data results in this thing. And one of the things that I found was this, one of the questions was for the most popular technologies. It says we asked about frameworks for the web, which ones were the most popular that people were using, and jQuery apparently, which gets a lot of hate, right? I don't know how you guys feel about jQuery, but it's this apparently in this subset of people, 63,000 people for this question. jQuery is the most broadly used of these web frameworks, but more developers this year said that they are using React more than Angular, right? A switch from last year is what they point out, and if I don't know if you guys can see this, but React gets 31.3% and Angular gets 30%. So they're right, kind of right at the same level. But it is gaining popularity, and I think there are some reasons why that's happening. So I think that there's just interesting results. So let's start with what is React, right? React is known as a JavaScript library, which is different from a framework. And what it means is that this is a great tool for medium-sized projects and smaller. It can be used for larger projects. It doesn't mean that it can't, right? But you will need to add other libraries as it keeps growing, right? They'll need these additional libraries. A framework, and there's a lot of discussion about this online. You guys can do your own research, right? But a framework typically is something that contains everything that you would need, right, to create this big application. I don't know which camp everybody here falls under, but
yeah, you should just move on, dude.
It's a great tool.
Touchy topic.
Yeah. There's actually a couple of things on here I think that I've seen great debate on, which are very interesting things, right? So the React is very useful for creating user interfaces. This is one of the things that that Facebook, right? We know that Facebook, their bread and butter is their website, right? So they want to create a very nice, intuitive user interface because they want people to remain on their app because that's how they make money. So obviously, when they create a tool like this, it's going to be great for that. It is a declarative library, right? And if you guys have done this research, right, declarative versus imperative. Declarative tells the browser what the UI should look like under certain conditions, right? Versus imperative, which tells the browser what steps to take. And this is kind of a hard concept, I think, to understand when you read it in plain English like this, right? But I think I found this great example from this guy, Tyler McGinnis, who I was going to plug this. I have it in my notes, right? We'll be at React Loop, and you can get your tickets at reactloop.com. So he gives this great example. React Loop, yeah, .com. So if you guys want tickets, they're still available. $169, $170. So he says, right, imperative, you can think about it this way, right? Imperative, a way to give directions, right? And an imperative way is to say, you go east on 290, then you get off on exit 24, you go straight for 3 miles, right? And then you take a right at 12th Street, and then the house that you're looking for is on the left, number 298, right? That's one way to give somebody directions to someone. Or a declarative way, you can just say, my address is 298 West Congress, right, Chicago, Illinois. And you're making an assumption that the person you're telling that to can figure out the rest, right? You're saying this is where you should end up, and I don't care how you get there, kind of, right? So I think that example right there kind of gets the point across versus what declarative and imperative is. React, right, is declarative. And we'll see examples of this once we see some code. React is also reusable. It is based on components, right? And ideally, these components are chunks of code that we write. And hopefully these are chunks of code that we can reuse across our application, right? Components should be reusable, and it hopefully makes our coding life easier. They can have state. These components can have something called state, and this is part of the input that goes into the component. And this state, right, can modify the output of the component, right? So depending on what goes in, the component inside will decide what to spit out and what to tell the browser that it should display. If you have done web development before, and maybe if you haven't, you've heard this too, but you might have heard that working with the DOM is expensive. I feel like I hear about this a lot. in general in the circles I run in. I don't know. But React uses JavaScript, right? React is JavaScript ultimately, and it uses JavaScript to write HTML. So it can keep like a virtual copy of the DOM, and again, I have a slide on specifically the virtual DOM, so that we can get a little bit deeper into it. But it keeps this virtual copy. So what it can do is it can detect, right, the differences that are in the virtual DOM from the real DOM, and then just insert the differences rather than painting the whole thing. So, and that process can get pretty complex, right? That's a very simple explanation of what it's doing. But essentially it's doing that so it doesn't have to redraw the entire DOM, right? So when we say the DOM is expensive, we want to try to change it as little as possible, and that saves time. So what problems does React or solve, right? Because if you were a developer or you're an architect or you get a chance at wherever you work to tell your manager, right, we should use React, you want to know why you should use React, right? You don't want to just use something because it's popular. So as we mentioned, right, operations to the DOM are expensive, and any time that you change it, it does take time. So that virtual DOM can help save time because of that copy that's managed in memory, right? You imagine sites nowadays that a lot of these sites use like the endless scroll idea, right? Instagram, I think, if you guys are on there, is a common one. And so what this is doing, right, as you're scrolling down, it's just inserting the new stuff, right? It's not redrawing the page every time you get to the bottom and reloading everything. So that's an example, right, of how it's just changing what's different, what has updated. It is modular, right? So we spoke a little bit about this. Components, by definition, they're modular. They're small standalone classes kind of that can then plug into each other. And theoretically, right, this allows for reuse of code. Since each component knows what inputs it can accept, it knows how to output itself, right? So a component, you could write it robust enough so that you could use it in different places, and that should hopefully save you time. Part of the modularity in React means that you can have your greater application be in something like .NET Core, for example, and just use React for certain parts, right? Your entire application doesn't have to be in React. It does play nice if it's running just in specific parts, and there are some bigger websites that do this. It's very beginner friendly. I've heard it been said that you can go from beginner to expert in 7 days with React. And I'm not sure how true that is. Maybe you guys have experience with this. I have anecdotal experience, but I have seen a couple people that have picked up React with zero web dev experience, and in about a week, I mean, they're not experts or anything like this, but they have a good handle at least on the basics, and they know what's going on and what a component is, what state is, and properties and that kind of stuff. So it is super beginner friendly. I think you guys will see that soon. Then there is, I don't know how to pronounce this, W-O-R-E. I don't think it's that way, but war maybe. Right, so this idea of write once, run anywhere. Right, so we mentioned React Native, and this is somewhere where I think React is getting to, and JavaScript as a whole, right? Because we all know that JavaScript is taking over the world, and because of that, React can work right now, at least on desktops, mobile devices. But I saw that they have it for VR now, and I don't even know where else you can imagine running React. But because JavaScript is just being allowed everywhere. The React is fully taking advantage of that. So ideally you would have an application that you just write once, and with very little modification you can run it in different environments. And then finally, the community for developers is great. Maybe you guys, if you guys are familiar with other libraries or other frameworks, you might have noticed that none of the stuff that I'm mentioning is unique to React, right? There are other things that do this stuff as well. But it seems to me, and this is just an opinion, right, but that React is kind of like the Apple of JavaScript, if you think about it this way, right? Apple is never the company that comes out first with a product, but what they do is refine a product, and right, you are in this ecosystem that just plays well. So React kind of feels this way, right? They took these concepts that might have been around already, and they made them popular and easy, and they're backed by some of the biggest, I mean, definitely the biggest company, in terms of web development. But they have so many other backers now that the support is great. Right. So now we will get into very specific concepts of React, right? And the very first one that I think is the most important, maybe, is a component, right? And probably everybody here understands what the word component means in plain English, right? But in React, everything is a component, right? And the way that I think about it is like a Lego creation, right? You buy the boxes of Legos and you can build whatever you want, but they come right with little Legos. It doesn't come pre-built or anything like that. They just give you these little Legos, and you can build something, and a lot of the pieces might be the same, right? Replicas of the same piece. But depending on how you put it together, you can build different things, right? And you're using the same blocks over and over again. Unlike Lego blocks, though, which are just, once they're made, that's what they are. A component can have data passed into it, which affects how it behaves, right? And that's the state and the props. Short for properties. So the nice thing is that if you have one component in two different places and you pass in different things to it, right, the one doesn't care about the other. They're completely independent of each other in that sense. And so, yeah, the custom HTML element, I think this is one of the coolest things about components, is that once you start writing these things, it really feels like you're building your own like custom HTML, right? And that's pretty much exactly what you're doing, right? But you're building whatever HTML you want, and it accepts whatever parameters you want, and it outputs whatever you want. It's really up to you. If you decide that you do not like the regular HTML button, right? You can build your own button, and nobody's going to stop you. Right? You can nest these components as well, right? That's kind of how it works, right? So you have components within components, and all of a sudden you have this giant creation that it's really should fit your needs. So it's very robust in that sense. And then, as I've been mentioning throughout the night, React is just JavaScript behind the scenes. So components, at the end of the day, are JavaScript classes with render methods or just fancy functions, right, that ultimately create HTML in plain JavaScript. So that's what a component is. And by the way, if there are any questions as we're going along, you can raise your hands, and we have experts in the crowd that will happily answer them for you. Because, yeah, a lot of the stuff that I'm telling you, this is exactly what I know. So this is very interesting for me. Right, so the virtual DOM. This is a very interesting idea because it is just that, right? It's kind of this idea, this algorithm versus like an object or something like this, right? But there's so much thinking behind it that it's really cool. You can get really deep into this idea, right? So, does anybody here know what DOM stands for, or right? Except for how about document object? Okay, all right, right. So, right, because we hear DOM all the time, right? And we know it has to do with web development, with the internet. I don't know, right? But this object model, right, is the parsed. What your browser decides that the code that you wrote, the HTML that you wrote, ultimately looks like, right? And every browser, it has like its own rules and its own way to interpret things, right? And it spits out this code that ultimately represents the DOM. Right, I think I read that one of the examples is that if you're writing a table in HTML and you forget to write like the header or something like this, like browser will put that in there for you because it knows that's what a table should look like. Right, so your HTML that you write is not exactly the DOM; it's the parsed representation of that. And there's a lot of material about this. Like I said, we can get very deep into this, but the reason why we hear that the DOM is slow or that it's expensive to work with is because the browser normally will just redo everything, right? It just reparses everything when there are changes, and that takes time. And I think many of you guys know that we're in a world nowadays, technologically, where if you have to wait more than 2 seconds for something to load, that the feelings begin of feeling that this is slow. Right, and you can read studies that tell you like how long is too slow nowadays, but everything that I saw was like 2 seconds, and just from my own experience, right, you're like, oh, maybe my internet's slow, I don't know, right? But so any time that you can save is better, right? And there's actually Netflix and I forget what other company. There's a couple of companies that have written blog posts where they will skim off like half a second or less than that of time of their load page or loading time for their main page, and they see an increase in revenue, right? And we're talking about milliseconds, I don't know, half a second. So any time that we can save for our clients or for our customers is always better. So right, this virtual DOM is an in-memory representation of that parsed HTML. And React uses this algorithm that they call reconciliation, which compares the virtual DOM, what it has in memory, to the real thing that the browser is parsing. Right, so when your application loads, right, it renders, React creates this, let me see if I can get this right, it creates a tree, right, that describes what it just created, right, the DOM that it generated, and then it saves that in memory. Now, when the app is updated, for example, if you use SetState, this function, right, which would change the component, which causes the component to regenerate, a new tree is built, and then it compares to this old tree, figures out what operations it needs to render the differences, and then it goes ahead and does that. And one thing that I found that's really interesting in this whole process is that there are two distinct steps happening here, right? There is the reconciliation, which is figuring out what's the difference, and then there's the rendering, which is actually inserting the different things into the tree, right? So reconciliation happens first, and this does the work of computing, right, which parts of the tree have changed. And then the rendering is the second part, which is takes that information and it actually paints it on the screen for you. And interesting thing in React, I think 16 is when it started. It's out there already, but it's called React Fiber, right? And there are some really interesting articles explaining what this is, but they're rewriting, or they rewrote the reconciler. And this is how they can kind of get React to work with mobile, for example, right? Because the reconciliation can happen independently of the rendering. So you can change the rendering part to render for different devices, and all of this information over here is the same. So with React Fiber, they're changing the reconciling part, and they have all this interesting theory and research that they've done, and it's based on like timing and how you want your stack to be used, and it gets, if you guys really like that kind of reading, it is actually very interesting. A little over my head, some of the stuff that they were talking about, but I'm sure there are people out there who enjoy that kind of stuff or understand it fully. Right, so The next thing is state. State is another very important concept. And state, what it does is it determines what a smart component should look like, right? Because you can have dumb components and you can have smart components. A dumb component is one that doesn't use state, right? It's pretty static. Ultimately, it doesn't really do anything other than display data in a specific way. And you pass that data into the props, the properties. And that thing will always display those properties, the data that you're passing in the same way. When you're passing in state, now or you kind of add like power to your component, right? Now your component has a new life, and this state can contain data that is specific to this component, but it may change over time, right? And that's the real power to it, because now your component is dynamic enough to where if the state changes, it can re-render itself as it's changing. And that's the really cool thing. And it's defined by you. You decide what the state is, what kind of stuff you're passing into your component, and what your component is doing as a result. Right? So, great example that I found from this website, Thinkster, right, is, and it goes into what the difference is between water and ice, right, if you think about this. Does anybody know what the difference is between water and ice? The
Temperature?
State. Temperature, right, it's the state, right? So the temperature is the point, the thing that causes it, right, to change. And so they say, right, the example is that the state of water, right, and here's, I'm using state in two different ways, right? The state meaning ice or liquid or steam or whatever, right, of water can change with changing one input, right, the temperature. Right, so in this example, if we were thinking about this in React terms and you had a component that was called water for whatever reason, right, and you were passing into it a state that contains temperature, and inside of your component you say, right, if the temperature is below, I don't know what's freezing, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, right, then return or render ice, right? If it's above, I think 212 is the boiling point, right, return steam. Otherwise, return water. So you could imagine, right, a component that does this by just passing in that, and anytime the temperature changes, that component will automatically regenerate itself based on that, that input. So I think you can do some really cool stuff with this. And then the last thing is that there's this theory of immutability with state, right? And it's not that it is immutable necessarily. Again, you can do some reading about this and figure out what you feel, but right, what it means is that you should not change state directly as if you were changing like a property or a number or a string or something like this, right? You need to use this function that is called SetState, right? And so I think behind the scenes what it's doing is making a copy of the current version and then using that. And again, there's a lot of theory behind this. So that's what state is. JSX, you will probably see this a lot too. If you do any React courses, you will see JSX. It's this new syntax that's kind of interesting, created for React. And the idea is to keep your HTML and your JavaScript, those two things in the same file, right? And one of the things that Facebook claims is that you can write a React app using 0 JSX. You don't need to, but I think it's like playing a game on hard mode, right? Like, why would you? Because there's no benefit to you, right? And I don't know, I know there's like YouTube channels where they play games on hard mode for the fun of it, but it's not really that fun. Like, try to make your life easier, you know? Right, so this JSX creates these elements. I have an example of it here. Like, that's an example of JSX there. Right, and it kind of looks like HTML, kind of looks like JavaScript, who knows? And it's really interesting because if you see curly braces in your code, then you know that you're looking somewhere in there is JSX. right? And within those curly braces, they say any valid JavaScript will work. So in the end, right after compilation, it boils down to JavaScript again. Where this really gets interesting is when you start throwing, right, like ES6 concepts. So you have like TypeScript in there, and then you know, it just gets really weird. Some of the stuff that I've seen, the examples, you don't know. HTML, I don't know. It gets really, some of the examples are very, very tricky, in my opinion. But with practice, I think it gets pretty easy to read to understand what's actually happening. And then that's it. Those are all of the concepts that I think are important, right, to understand how to begin a React application. And I do have a very quick and simple example that I can pull up here.
Hey, Erwin.
Yeah.
You had all those links there at the end. Are you gonna find a way to share your presentation, maybe in the meetup comments or something?
Yeah, I can send that. I can send that out to you, or I can post it on there. I think, right?
Wherever, yeah.
Okay.
Let's
see.
You're gonna have to zoom that way in for my friend back here.
Yeah.
Damn young people.
You're on a Mac?
Nope.
No? Then Control Plus.
Control Shift. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so what I'm doing here is, if you go and look up like a React Hello World, you will find this thing called Create React App, right? And something that if you have done any sort of JavaScript development, you hopefully know what this is, right? Visual Studio Code, and there are other editors and whatnot that you can use. But some of the basic things that you need installed on your computer for this to work is Node. I think version like 6 and onwards, and if you install Node, it comes with NPM, which is your package manager, and you need a specific version of that too, but if you're doing this for the first time, you probably are going to have the most recent versions anyway. So once you install these two things, you can go on your computer here, or a command prompt, or right, and you type in like npx, I think, create React app, and what it does is it downloads all these files for you onto your computer and creates this nice little starter Hello World project, which is what you're looking at here. And pretty much every library or framework nowadays, if they're cool, they have these generators, right? If they don't have these generators, don't trust them. But so these, right? It creates this like this base project. You can think of it that way for you, because you know all this stuff is the same anyway. So no need to waste your time creating all this by hand. So if you once it installs all this stuff, all you do is you do npm start, and this should bring up a browser for me. And this is exactly what you would see if you did this on your computer, right? It has this spinning thing. Excuse me. So what I did was I went ahead and created a folder called components inside of the source folder. And there's nothing special about this or fancy about it. It's just a way, I mean, if you guys have done programming, you know there's a way to organize your files. And I added two very, very simple components in here to get the point across about what we spoke about. Right, so the first file, the file that really matters that this app is going to look for, is this index file. And in here, what I'm doing is I am rendering this line number 9 here. I am rendering a component, right? You can see here where I have app. It looks like HTML, right? But it's not really HTML in this case. Ultimately it is, right? But I'm telling it to render my component, which is called app. So what I did was I just overwrote that, and I'm going to change the import so that it's pointing to the correct one, so that it's pointing to the one that I wrote. And I could have used a different name. Doesn't matter, right? But this app component here is what I'm treating as like my parent component, right? And this is like the head of everything, which is just one other component. And what this app does is it has 2 text boxes and a button. One text box is for you to write in your name, and the next one is for you to write in your age. And I'm going to ask for some help here soon, and you do not have to give me your real age if you do not want to. But then when you press the button, what it's going to do is, if you see here, I am maintaining in my state for this component, right, a list. And all of this is just plain JSON, right? There's nothing special about this. But I'm maintaining a list which has objects that contain a name and an age. So when you press that button, what it does is it adds this new data to this list. And the component is smart enough to re-render what it needs to render, right? And what will happen is it passes that data into, it uses a map, which I know we've seen here maybe 2 or 3 classes ago, right here. So it takes that list, right, and it says for everything that's in this list, create another component, which is the card component, and pass in this data. That card component, I'll open it up for you guys. Very simple. What it spits out is a couple of divs, and it's just displaying the name that you passed in and the age that you passed in a nice little box. And I am using Bootstrap here. There's a question at the end as to what library you guys that do work with React every day love to use. Is it Bootstrap? Is it not Bootstrap? So I'd love to hear responses on that. But right, so do you guys understand conceptually at least what's happening here? Does anybody have any? Okay. I think it's very, very simple, right? So I have a function here, right, for onSubmit for my button, and all this does is it just reads, right, the name and the age. It adds it to the data to this list, and then we use SetState, right, to tell the component that the data has changed, that it has updated. I reset the 2 text boxes, and then I just focus again on the name box. So once I save this, if I go back to here, you should see that this thing automatically updates, right? And I've added my own information here. So do I have any volunteers?
Here you go.
Rob.
Rob.
27.
27, all right. Rob, I saw you at Starbucks today.
Did you?
Yeah. I know.
I think he works in this building,
Yeah.
He does.
Okay.
On
Yeah.
the 3rd floor, around the
so
corner.
it's not creepy.
He knows where you work. That's even more weird. Anyone else? Mark.
Hey, my name's Joe.
Hey, Joe. Okay. What's your age?
Too old.
Only accepts numbers.
Oh, I didn't say that.
200. Right, so you see every time I press save, right, it adds another box, and all it's doing is right, adding information to that list, and every time that list gets updated, since it's part of the state, the component is keeping track of that through SetState, and it just decides, all right, I'm going to run this map function again, and I'm going to build however many components I need to. And if you look, we'll do this in here.
Can you zoom in, please?
Yeah. Is that good?
Right.
Okay, so you see in here, every one of these divs is a box, right? So if I could have another helper, please. Somebody.
Mark,
Mark.
62.
Right, so take a look at what's going to happen here in this section when I press the save button. And that, I think, is a very simple but cool example, right, of what this is doing, right? It's looking at what the parsed, right, HTML looks like and figuring out what the new one looks like, figuring out what's the difference, and then putting in just the difference. right? Nothing else changed on this page. So I think something like this really gets the point across if you guys start digging into this, and I can send this to zip it up, and you guys can install it on your
You want to put
computer.
it on GitHub.
I don't
Zip
know,
it up
man.
and send it to me.
I'll send you a couple of. I don't know if I have a GitHub. I have to check. But if I'll try to put it on there and just send out the link so you guys can just download this.
Need to text messages.
Oh.
We should have a GitHub site, which I literally sent him like 10 minutes ago.
Oh, that's a good idea.
I mean, we've
You
been
got a
doing
weird-
this for
you
2.5 years, and it only just occurred to me.
You've got a strange area code that just, I don't answer those.
Right, sure. We should have one.
We kind of do. I started that website like 3 years ago and never.
Yeah, never did anything. Yeah, right, I know. Because like Ernesto's got code he could share too.
Yeah.
I actually think, and I was going to say this afterwards, I was like, we should just base the entire rest of this React series of talks. We should just use this code, like, because I look at it, I'm like, and if just in case everyone isn't aware, this is React for beginners by a beginner.
Yes.
So like, if you've done a bunch of React development and you were kind of like, ooh, some of the stuff that Erwin said, like that was the whole point of this, is to get a person brand new to React talking
He's
about
also
it.
a really stupid, smart beginner.
Oh yeah, no, you killed it. It's fine.
Yeah, I think it gets you to the point where you understand, hopefully at a conceptual level, right, what state is, what components are, and you kind of get your toe in the water, so to speak, right, with JSX and understanding, right, the mixture of HTML and JavaScript. So there's a lot of good stuff in a simple application like this. I think that if you're beginning, or if you've never used this, if, like you said though, if you have used this, probably lots of more improvements that we could make. So it would be very interesting to see how an application starts this way and then starts progressing into a more, right, I don't know, enterprise level or whatever we want to say. So that is all that I have for you guys. Are there any questions? Hopefully not, because you guys understood everything, right?
I have a question. When does the re-rendering happen? When you change the state?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
So you don't have to. You have to change the state and then render. As soon as you change the state, it happens.
Yeah, it's the asynchronous function that's happening.
That was what the original render thing you did in your beginning was.
Yes.
That says, hey, render this, and that means anytime you change the state, it'll automatically update.
Yes, but it just updates this component, right? Not the
Other
index,
ones.
Not the, yeah, right.
So if that one isn't displayed, it won't update it.
Well,
It'll get updated, you just won't see it.
Yeah. So I don't know. Do you guys?
yeah, I have like a
more?
million things I want to say, but I feel like
Which is why his explanation is better.
yeah.
This is why I preface, right? This is generally true. So all right, let's start here. Then we'll go with Jenny, then Rob.
So what are the main advantages of using React.js over other libraries and frameworks?
I think that's a good question. Main advantages of using this over other, I think it depends on what kind of application you're going to be building, right? What the size of it is. It's very easy to use. As you see, it's from zero to getting an app up and running. It's very easy. But the components, to me, I think are the best part, right? Because you can kind of build out your own components, and if you design a website well enough and you see places where you could reuse a lot of stuff, then I think this is a good tool to use. It doesn't mean it's a silver bullet or anything like that, right? Obviously, Angular is better for different things, but yeah, if you're building a nice UI, I think this is a good place to start. Jenny, you got a question?
I do, yeah. So I know you're a beginner, and this is for beginners. So I'm curious, how long have you been working with React? Because I know you said in the beginning too that some people say it could be like 7 days before
Right.
you master it. So I'm just curious how long you've been working with it.
Yeah, 10 days.
10 days. Okay.
No, everything that I know about React has been when I have downtime here at work, and I go through some. Or it has been in the context of SharePoint Framework, which is kind of React, but a little different still. Right, so the majority of the stuff that I know about React is in the context of SharePoint Framework, which, it's still, a very small project that I did. So not a lot of pure React development.
Do you feel like it was easy for you to pick up?
Super easy. So I know we have some people right now here at PSC that, one guy that I can think of specifically who had 0 web development experience, had only seen HTML once or twice in his life, no JavaScript experience, and went in and, in the context of SharePoint Framework, was able to pick up what React does and what state does and what properties do. So fast and he's making these UIs, that look super nice and that you would totally be okay with presenting, showing off to somebody, right? So I think it definitely, the ease of use is great. And Rob, you had a question?
Yeah, when you were talking about the virtual DOM and how it's like basically DOM manipulation is costly, I don't know much about DOM, but so every time you would normally make a change to the DOM, like let's say I was just using vanilla JavaScript and I was just saying like append child, it would repaint the entire thing?
I don't think when you're appending child it does that. I think when you're appending child, I think that's what this is doing. And maybe
I think when you append child, you're probably at a bare minimum repainting the parent. But then there's a whole bunch of other things that may be getting recalculated based on that. And so with the virtual DOM, what you get is in the reconciliation process, not only do you get that in-memory comparison, you get, and this was kind of where I almost wanted to jump in earlier, everything that lives inside of, from the React DOM render, which he's doing in the index.js, right, and it's rendering out app. Everything under that index.js is treated kind of like a DOM. So the DOM, well, it's called object model, or model is actually a tree. And so the virtual DOM is just an in-memory representation of that tree. The diffing process figures out the least amount of changes to make the new one, but then as a whole, inside of that very simple React DOM render method, it's also going to batch those updates so that it's always making the least amount of changes to the DOM in order to refresh the DOM. And so in the context of developing React applications, you can almost treat it like the good old days where we just said refresh the whole page. Everything's server side. Every time you click, it's a reload. You can almost develop like that, but it's not actually happening.
Okay. So when it kind of batches those things up for writing them out, that's why like if there's a change of state but it doesn't affect how it's displayed, it's not going to do anything.
I think that's accurate. But my point was really more to the question you had, which was inside of a singular component, every time you change the state, the render method's being fired. While that is true, that does not mean it's being written out to the DOM every single time, every single component is firing render. It's all kind of being fed into the virtual DOM, which is why you'll generally see every application have a single component as the root or parent component. And that's your new tree, that's your tree, and so everything's kind of being fed up there. And then the diffing process, which also goes way over my head. But it's a collective, all of your little components that are rendering, these two may be rendering at the same time, but it's not going to execute two different renders. It's figuring out the difference in memory and then outputting that to the DOM on that line right there, not every single component that's firing off.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's pretty smart.
So, do you know, does React still use the document.append child, or does it have some other low level?
I don't know. Justin?
I can find out. I'll find out. I would assume, because I don't know what other low-level JavaScript.
I wouldn't be shocked to find out it uses like insert adjacent HTML or something like that, which is actually like nobody uses it, but it's like super performant. So, and they're pretty smart dudes on the React team.
Yeah,
So-
I'm telling you, if you guys start reading in like deep into some of these concepts, like they go really into like the science part of computer science. Like it gets real interesting. Cool. Any other questions, or I think we're good? It's 8 o'clock.
Yes.
Alarm went off.
So this is why it's so popular with single-page applications, is this automatic refresh thing. You can just create, like you said, like the old school, you like go back and forth. You don't have
That's why
to
all
worry
the kids
about it.
love the single page.
Yeah, it's the run back to the server, get the whole
Well, I
thing
mean,
again.
technically, Backbone was single-page applications. Angular is single-page. They're all single-page applications. But that's really it. Like you go back to when Ajax became an idea, and you're talking about updating parts of our page instead of having to redraw the
Right,
whole
go
page.
doing Ajax and doing a pen child.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thank you guys.
Thank you.